In our previous lecture, we looked at the European models for managing ethnic differences. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the Asian and Oceanic models, with particular emphasis on China and Australia. First, the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China is a multi-ethnic nation with 55 official ethnic minority groups, encompassing nearly 114 million or 8.5% of the total population. Putting this in perspective, if the ethnic minority population of China was a nation state, it would be the world's 12th most populous nation, or 1.6% of the world's population. In China, the concept of ethnicity is fairly straightforward and by some sociological accounts rigid, stemming from the controversial categorization of official ethnic minorities by the Communist Party of China in 1949. When the Communist Party came into power, they commissioned studies to categorize ethnic groups within the boundaries of the People's Republic. In 1953, they numbered over 400 plus registered groups. After detailed research and fieldwork investigating ethnic minorities' social history, economic life, language, and religion, studies found that there was a lot of overlap and a significant number of groups that claimed to be separate actually belonged to existing groups, albeit with different names. As a result, by 1979, there were 55 official ethnic minority groups in China. In determining what constituted an ethnic minority group, 4 official criteria was used. First, a distinct language. While there are virtually hundreds, perhaps thousands of dialects spoken across China, a minority language is not simply a dialect. It is a language with distinct grammatical and phonological differences, such as Tibetan. 21 ethnic minority groups in China have unique writing systems. Continuing along the other types of criteria, we see a recognized indigenous homeland within the boundaries of China being very salient. Third, distinctive customs ranging from dress, religion, or foods. And finally, a strong sense of identity, although at times this is loosely interpreted. The question really remains, what is the purpose of officially classifying ethnic minority groups in China? To answer this question, we need to understand that official ethnic minorities are guaranteed equal rights under China's constitution and are given numerous preferential treatment in social policies. It is here that we start to see similarities, at least on paper, with the Canadian context. For example, China's National Minorities Policy of 1999 articulates the idea in this particular fashion. And I quote, "All ethnic groups in the People's Republic of China are equal. The state protects the lawful rights and interests of the ethnic minority and upholds and develops a relationship of equality, unity, and mutual assistance amongst all of China's ethnic groups. Discrimination against and oppression of any ethnic group are prohibited." Interestingly enough, we see this is almost near verbatim to Section 6 of the 1988 Multiculturalism Act in Canada, which stipulates that we should encourage and assist individuals and organizations to project the multicultural reality of Canada, to undertake research relating to Canadian multiculturalism, to encourage cooperation and an exchange amongst the diverse ethnic groups of Canada, and to assist ethnic minority groups in conducting activities with a view of overcoming any discriminatory barrier. Now, returning to China, what we do see is that due to these special rights and preferential treatments afforded to ethnic minorities, the status of an ethnic minority citizen cannot be altered at their discretion. An example of this sort of special rights and preferential treatments can be seen in formal education. Institutions of higher learning and vocational secondary schools often give preferential treatment to applicants of ethnic minorities. Some universities may even set ratios between ethnic minorities and Han applications for their incoming class. Ethnic minorities who come from poorer income geographical clusters may also be granted even lower qualified entry marks to enter higher education. There's also special assistance to ethnic minority students enrolled in primary and secondary schools. It is at the implementation stage that comparisons between Canada and Chinese policies towards managing ethnic groups is varying. In spite of China's rapid development, it is conducted in a very unbalanced manner, whereby the eastern provinces are being developed much quicker than the western provinces, where 3/4 of all ethnic minorities reside. The underlying premise here is that for multicultural social policies to be effective, particularly at the implementation stage, it requires a certain level of economic development. As such, when we examine the feasibility and potential success of multiculturalism as a programmatic social policy in China akin to Canada, it can best be realized at this juncture in the relatively developed urban spaces. The Beijing case gives us this sort of relatively developed urban space example. Unknowing to many, Beijing's demographics encompasses all 55 ethnic minority groups in China, and they encompass over 600,000 registered persons in this capital city. In respect to social policies governing ethnic minorities, the Beijing government has adhered to 5 basic principles that echo the intentions of China's national minorities policy. The first is an adherence to equity and unity among ethnic groups. The second is that all ethnic groups can participate as equals in the management of state and local affairs. Third, all official ethnic groups have the freedom and right to use and develop their own spoken and written language. Fourth, education for minorities must be developed to improve the quality of the minority population. And finally, there are guarantees that there's going to be a preservation of cultural heritage of ethnic minorities, such as famous historical monuments, scenic spots, and rare cultural relics. Tangibly, when examining the educational attainment of ethnic minority populations, we see that Beijing's multiculturalism policy, in effect, is relatively successful in comparison to the rest of the nation. One can thus simply dismiss these educational figures of ethnic minorities as a clear case of the relatively developed urban environment stacked with greater financial and teaching resources outperforming the not-so-developed areas where a significant number of ethnic minorities reside throughout the nation. Yet, we see in this table a very interesting trend that provides further insight into the success of Beijing's policies towards ethnic minorities in education. What is observed is that even the ethnic minority population in Beijing outperforms or is on par with the Han population in educational attainment. What this tells us is that Beijing has been quite successful in implementing the nation's and city's multicultural policies. A large part of this success is due to the preferential treatment that ethnic minorities have received throughout the education system. Notwithstanding, an interesting paradox seemingly arises when examining the ethnic demographics of those working in high-wage, education-intensive employment sectors in Beijing. One will expect, given similar educational attainment levels among the ethnic minority and Han populations of Beijing, this will be reflected in the ethnic demographics in the employment sectors. Rather, when we look at this table, we see that Han dominates each of the high-wage educational intensive sort of sectors. Bearing in mind the average pre-tax wage was about 34,000 RMB or $4,400 per annum, Han Chinese dominate each employment sector above this. Put differently, only 20% of the ethnic minority population work above the average pre-tax income in Beijing, which virtually comprises only of high-wage education-intensive employment sectors. The remaining 80% of ethnic minorities working in the sort of labor market in Beijing do so in labor-intensive employment sectors, such as farming, forestry and animal, construction, manufacturing, or the hotel, restaurant, and retail trades. One explanation behind this paradox may be the fact that high-wage education-intensive employment sectors are dominated by an older working generation. Therefore, the younger, highly educated ethnic minority generation has yet to reap the benefits of the high wages in these attractive employment sectors. While this may hold true when examining many developed nations, Beijing's high-wage education-intensive employment sectors are dominated by those under the age of 40. As such, the idea that it's just a matter of waiting to see educated ethnic minorities breaking through the ranks of these sectors does not hold to a great extent. There is something more to this that goes beyond statistical analysis. And in fact, as we continue our lecture series, we will engage in some possible explanations behind this reality. When we look at the future of multiculturalism in China, we must point out that there is still a strong Han prejudice, either intentional or not, and this plays a significant role in explaining this paradox. Ethnic minorities in China are seen in a very commodifying and stereotypical imagery, as being backward, barbaric, and having a culture that is dramatically different than the Han Chinese. Combating deep-seated prejudices is a difficult proposition for any social policy, but it is here that we can borrow many lessons learned from the Canadian experiences. In the late 1980s to mid-1990s, as we saw in earlier lectures, anti-discrimination policies were strongly emphasized and was inspired by multicultural policy in Canada. During this period, and even at present day in some quarters, many argue ethnic minorities are excluded from entry into professions, thus contributing to economic inequalities for ethnic minority groups. Affirmative action programs and equal employment policies was the policy reaction. When we look at the Chinese context, there is in effect an affirmative action policy in education for ethnic minorities. Thus, the logic can be extended to the workplace environment. However, this will be met with strong opposition as the notion of affirmative action denotes a negative connotation in the Chinese context. In fact, it's seen as being taken care of or getting a discount or being special. And thus, by implementing an affirmative action sort of policy in the workplace, it is seen as signaling to Han Chinese that ethnic minorities are different, inferior, and are in need of government assistance to get ahead. This in turn further perpetuates negative stereotypes and increased prejudice of ethnic minorities, the very idea that fuels the paradox of ethnic minority development in Beijing. What is accepted amongst many ethnic minorities is that the government should attempt to promote, in a very covert manner, more ethnic minority leaders in the workforce, especially in the upper echelons of management in public and private workplaces. Consensus in the manner in which this should be conducted, however, has not been fully recognized, and this is where the future challenges lie, and where the Canadian experience can be used as a guide. Policymakers can learn a great deal from Australia, notably in its attempts to screen for migrant workers with special skills or high levels of education. In Australia, so-called independent migrants without relatives in the destination country can gain admission by passing a points test that weighs characteristics such as age, education, language ability, and occupation. Some applicants with more distant relatives in the destination country are evaluated by a points test, which in this case awards points for both skills and the closeness of the family relationship. In addition, immigrants to Australia can be admitted because they possess special talents or because they meet certain investment requirements and intend to establish a business in Australia. Immigrants entering Australia through any of the avenues just described are categorized as skilled immigrants because the human capital and potential labor market success of these applicants play a key role in their admission. Besides differences in immigration policy, we do see that there are structural and institutional differences in the labor market of Australia relative to other countries such as the United States or the United Kingdom, which are likely to influence the type of immigrants who are attracted to Australia. For many reasons, stronger labor unions, higher minimum wages, national health insurance, more generous unemployment insurance, and a welfare system, workers in the lower end of the income distribution are generally better off in Australia than in, say, the United States, especially relative to the average worker. Also, it's worthwhile to note, in Australia, immigrant fluency rates rise monotonically with the length of the time since arrival. This pattern is largely due to the fact that immigrants who do not speak English when they arrive tend to acquire fluency over time as they adapt to their new life in Australia. Given the substantial weight that the immigration point system used in Australia has placed on language skills, the data seems to indicate that the Australian point system has been quite effective at tilting the immigration flow towards those proficient in English. Immigration point systems like those used in Australia might be particularly effective at screening out immigrants from the bottom tail of the education distribution. As we conclude our lecture on Asian and Oceanic models, we will look at our next lecture at how immigration is operationalized globally. We will look at migration patterns and we'll look at the immigration debate in national contexts.